As music fans, we all sadly know what it feels like to wake up one morning and realize that one of our heroes is either gone or no longer a part of the band that we love. This was something that was apparent for both Avenged Sevenfold and Dream Theater fans from a time period between 2009 and 2010. It all started December the 28th, 2009, when Avenged Sevenfold and their fans woke up to realize that Jimmy the Rev Sullivan was no longer a part of their lives. He unfortunately died of an overdose of painkillers and other medication, and also had an enlarged heart, which was seen as something that also had an effect on this. 9 months later, after he had helped out Avenged Sevenfold with their Nightmare record doing their drum parts, Mike Portnoy left Dream Theater, citing 25 years worth of burnouts. Some people began to believe that perhaps his influence or his participation in Nightmare was something that perpetuated some of these feelings. However, that's really in the eye of the beholder. And that's what brings us to our question. That's why What If is here. It was posed by somebody over on the Cover Killer Legion Facebook fan group, and now it has become an actual question we need to answer. What would have happened if the Rev hadn't died in December of 2009, and if Mike Portnoy hadn't left Dream Theater in 2010? Now, right out of the get-go, I want to dismiss the fact that these two ideas are truly connected. They're only connected in the fact that Mike Portnoy was asked to do the drum parts for Nightmare and accepted. There's nothing that really has anything to do with him deciding to leave Dream Theater after doing his work with Avenged Sevenfold. Anybody who feels that A7X sabotaged Dream Theater are simply out of their minds. However, there is also a secondary thing that must be stated, and that's the fact that we're going to be focusing more so on the Rev as opposed to Mike Portnoy here, because his side of the story is actually a little bit shorter, so best get the Rev out of the way, and we're going to try and tackle them a bit concurrently. So let's go back to December the 28th, 2009, the day in which people woke up and the Rev was no longer there. Now, in this situation, I still believe that the Rev has this chaotic night where he obviously took a lot of medication, and instead of him overdosing and passing on based around this, he instead overdoses and is rushed to the hospital. Somebody discovers the Rev, either that or he makes a phone call. Something happens to prevent this death from happening, from occurring, and he ends up in the facility in a hospital bed and has to reevaluate his life a little bit. His bandmates surround him, and it just doesn't look like a very good situation. The Rev had penned a song that was going to be on Nightmare 3 days prior entitled Fiction, which originally carried the title, I believe, of Death, which makes a lot of folks believe that perhaps it was a bit of a premonition that this was going to occur, but instead he gets the second chance. Nightmare is a record that was supposed to have a dark concept to begin with. However, this night causes the Rev to really want to deliver more for this dark concept, including a couple more tracks that are a bit, he wants to be a little bit therapeutic for himself, considering he has now decided that he's going to go into rehab and hopefully come out of this a lot better. He pens a couple of songs, including one entitled Breathing Needles, which, even though the death itself in the reality, here in the real world, but the overdose itself didn't have anything really to do with heroin or anything needle-based, it's still a metaphor that certainly makes sense and applies to a lot of other folks. If you recall, Avenged Sevenfold is a band that is a bit personal, but at the same time also speaks for a wide swath. So, based around this and a couple of new tracks penned by Sinister Gates, including a really touching instrumental song that follows Breathing Needles entitled The Morning After, we have on our hands a really interesting concept album of individuals that are dealing with addiction and also dealing with other nightmares that are associated with life, such as abuse and such as rape, things of that variety. So the whole entire album starts to become a dark, brooding concept about the nightmares that people have to face, and of course the ones that include the Rev feel very real, considering that they are. Nightmare is not released in 2010 based off of this. They instead take a little bit more time to allow the Rev to succeed at rehab, but also to really fine-tune all of these works. So this is an album that isn't released until 2011. Meanwhile, with Dream Theater, Mike Portnoy is starting to get that same bug. He's starting to get that same feeling that he legitimately did. He's starting to feel burnt out, and it goes in and proposes a hiatus to the group. Instead, though, of saying that that's not something that they're planning to do, they instead reach the the agreement that they're going to do one more album and then reevaluate things from there. And Mike basically agrees to do the same thing. He's feeling that he may need some time away from the group, and that if that's not the decision that they made after releasing one more record, then that's exactly what he was going to do. So already going into 2011, we have the Rev, who has now gotten out of rehab. It has been successful. They release Nightmare to thunderous acclaim. Meanwhile, Dream Theater is working on an album that is going to be released later on that fall. And that release ends up not being, obviously, a dramatic turn of events, considering that was a title that was directly influenced by Mike Portnoy deciding to leave the band. Instead, this album ends up being the self-titled release. It ends up being just Dream Theater. And this album is seen as a little bit more of the same from the group. There doesn't seem to be too many leaps and bounds forward that has been given ever since albums such as Black Clouds and Silver Linings, etc. So instead, this is an album that is received fairly, lukewarm by the fans, but is instead not seen as sort of the transformative, breathing in new life to Dream Theater in the 2010s. So after this album is concluded and released, the band decides that they still wish to press on, which is something that truly sort of dissatisfies Mike Portnoy, who now has essentially, told them that he would do another year, he would make sure that the record was released, and then they should really consider a hiatus. With them not doing that, Mike still decides to leave. This is why I say that his story is a little bit shorter, considering no matter which way that you look at this, quite honestly, Mike Portnoy leaving Dream Theater just seems 100% to be in the cards. But what about the Rev? Does he still continue on with rehab? Does he relapse? Do we get Hail to the King? Let's take a look once again. After the release of Nightmare, the band goes and tours, and the lifestyle of the road has a lot of temptations for the Rev. However, it's one that for the first half of the tour he is able to, distance himself from, but as the tour begins to wane on, temptation starts to really rear its ugly head, and he starts to get a little bit back into the same scene. He is in some pain, he does want to have a good time with some of the guys, etc., etc. So he does, unfortunately, suffer a minor relapse. This is something, though, that is not seen as incredibly heartbreaking. He goes back into rehab almost instantaneously to try to quell this problem before it gets completely out of control, and the band instead decides to take a little bit of time off. That way he can sort of get everything straight, distance him from the life a little bit. Meanwhile, just to sort of screw around and have a little bit of fun, Sinister Gates and the Rev decide to revive a couple of old projects of their own. One name that certainly comes to mind is Pinkly Smooth. Meanwhile, Sinister also decides that he's going to release a solo record just of guitar work, something that he's never really cited that he's ever wanted to do. However, he decides and opts to give it a go. And there are some special guest appearances from other members of the band. In fact, most fans believe that this is merely the next Avenged Sevenfold album being written, only it's being done so in some sort of strange promotional fashion, or just the boys being the boys. Instead, it ends up being just a traditional guitar album, an instrumental disc, that ends up doing fairly well for being released online only by Sinister Gates, and eventually does get a gatefold release to the public. Now, whenever it comes to Hail to the King, this is an album that I don't think happens quite the same way in which it does. The success of Nightmare, I believe, would propel this group in order to kind of revisit some of, not the same ideas, but revisit the idea of maybe a full-scale concept release. So, here in 2016, we saw The Astonishing by Dream Theater, but in 2014, or perhaps even 2015, instead of Hail to the King, you would instead get from Avenged Sevenfold a more traditional conceptual release that perhaps is talking more along the lines of heartbreak associated with some form of terrible, terrible thing, whether it be tackling the idea of addiction or torture, whatever it may be, or just battling and making a traditional concept release. Because Nightmare was meant to be sort of like an Operation Mindcrime or a release of that variety, but just sort of ended up taking on a life of its own based around the Rev's death and became very much centered around his life. So with the new Nightmare that with Rev on it that we have created, it now becomes certain that they would probably want to tackle another conceptual release, but maybe not use the same trick twice. And what I think you would get, actually, is Avenged Sevenfold being the band that attempts the double album. They would attempt the double album based around this. They would get quite a concept going, and in 2015, instead of 2013, you get the follow-up to Nightmare. So there would be about 4 years worth of a gap between Nightmare and whatever this album in 2015 would be called. I actually don't know what they would call it. This is something where, in the comments below, you should give it a name. And this is going to be an album that would be a little polarizing. It's very similar to The Astonishing in some ways. Some people saying that it was just too massive of an idea, something that was just way too big. But also it is something that's praised very highly by the media, by the press, and by reviewers for being extremely ambitious and coherent. So not as similar to The Astonishing as you might think, but still something that's there. Moving along from 2016 onward, the Rev does continue to be a part of the band. However, he still keeps a very, very close eye on, his level of addiction, either that or anything that he does need to take. I believe that relapse will consistently be a problem for him, but it's something where it's up to him to decide whether or not to go in. I think that the Rev eventually does, unfortunately, succumb the same way in which he does, though I don't think that you would see that until closer to 2020, whenever he's a little bit older and where any sort of major relapse could have very, very bad lasting effects, perhaps damaging permanently, either that or could result, obviously, in death. Mike Portnoy, on the other hand, does end up leaving the band, and so the group does do the drummer search that you saw whenever he left, in reality. I still believe that they end up with Mike Mangini because they had a connection with this guy, and he really seemed like one of the favorites and one of the front runners from the very beginning. So Mangini, I believe, still ends up in the group, only this is something that happens in 2012 as opposed to 2011, or perhaps even later, 2013, all things considered because of the touring cycle for the Dream Theater album, which is the one that they've released now based off of our timeline. So I think that the next album that you see after that, perhaps in 2014 or 2015, is actually a dramatic turn of events. And I think that you're still going to see this title because even though this was an idea and a concept that Portnoy had kind of warned the rest of the guys about and wanted to do this in order to preserve some of their friendships, they still feel a little bit betrayed. They still feel a little bit of that tug. They still thought that Mike would come around and that this was just him talking out of exhaustion, and that passion and that fire would eventually regain itself in his belly. Also, because of this, I don't think you see the Adrenaline Mob side project, or if you do, it would be something that would be moving at a slower pace than it actually did. So perhaps that material would be a little bit better, but maybe that's just wishful thinking on my behalf. You would still see the Winery Dogs, and you would still see the Flying Colors projects, considering those are more traditional toward what Mike Portnoy was participating in as far as projects were concerned, where he was just merely the skinsman, not someone that was kind of critical to this super group idea that you saw with Adrenaline Mob with Russell Allen, the guys from Stuck Mojo or Fozzy, whatever it may be, or Disturbed, whatever member that they had that week. So, with that being said, Mike Portnoy's off to do his own thing. I think he still continues with the side project idea like you see to this day. Meanwhile, I don't think you see The Astonishing or anything like it from Dream Theater until maybe 2017, 2018, somewhere deeper down the road, mainly because I feel that the band would want to have 2 albums with Mike Mangini underneath their belt, similar to what you see today, before they attempt a lavish concept such as The Astonishing. Even though this is something that very easily could have been written and already handled by John Petrucci and the rest of the gang, I just don't see them kind of, firing the gun on this idea immediately. I still feel that a dramatic turn of events would almost seemingly be a trial, either that or a test for Mangini, similar to what it is in reality. There would want to be one more album which could have, whatever title that you want. Put that title in the comments. Maybe it's Asleep, maybe it's Dream Theater Part 2, the Dream Harder, whatever the hell you want to call it, and then you would see The Astonishing. So there you have it. And I think that this is something where Portnoy will never actually come back to Dream Theater. I don't see him coming back. Maybe to do some reunion work whenever the band has decided that studio albums are just kind of apropos, not something that they want to handle anymore. Maybe you'll see him return then. That way they can do a couple of fair and honest send-offs. But aside from that, on the drums, it's Mike Mangini's baby. and Mike Mangini is going to sort of be the runt of the litter this whole entire time, considering everybody else in this band has been a part of it for 10 to 15 years. So that's my thoughts about what would happen if the Rev didn't die, and if Mike Portnoy didn't leave Dream Theater. Mike Portnoy still leaves Dream Theater, and the Rev ends up going on this up and down journey that could still hypothetically result in his death. However, it's one that feels a lot more delayed, based around just one decision being made differently, either that or one breath continuing in his lungs as opposed to no longer his heart beating. I want to know what you guys think about this. Leave your answers and your thoughts in the comments below. Of course, the Cover Killer Legion Facebook group, the link for that is in the description box below, so you can come on board and potentially have your idea used for a episode of What If, or any of the other series that we have running here on the channel. And patrons are also seen as very, very highly regarded whenever it comes to content and things of that variety. There's a link to the CKN Patreon, which we're trying to get to 250 for a 24 hours of CKN event. And in that event, if you were to be a patron at that time, you would be able to influence 50% of the content that is going to be created for that 24 hours of CKN event later on in April. I'm Cover Killer Nation. Leave me your thoughts and your comments about this episode of What If in the comments below, and also suggest some for the next time. I'll talk to you later.